couple of weeks ago, most of you went down to Los Angeles, and there was a good presentation made by the class in general. And the main purpose for this was to become familiar with the area so that the discussion that Herb Kahn will take you through this morning would be more understandable. And Herb is, most of you I think know Herb, he's spoken here before. He's a partner in the firm, usually heads up most of the planning work in Kappe, and has pretty much, along with Rex, headed up this circulation distribution program that has a fancier name. We used to call it a people mover study for LA. So this morning Herb will take you through the amount of work we've done so far. I guess the study's about halfway through, or a little better than halfway through, and we'll discuss primarily I guess the decision-making processes that have gone on and where we are at this point in time. So Herb, you want to take over?
Okay, is this thing working? Or doesn't it make any difference?
Doesn't sound. Isn't it going?
I don't know. Is it? Okay. Last time I was here, I did a monologue for about 2 hours on planning, and I got no feedback from the group, and I don't intend to do that today. So I'm going to try to zip through complicated process as fast as I can, and I'd like to get a lot of interaction back on this thing. To start off, we're actually in a transportation planning situation. To give you a little background before I get into the study, though, what it's all about. This is the study area. Essentially, we have been asked to do a circulation and distribution system for the CBD, or Central Business District, for Los Angeles. The reason the study area extends out and beyond the CBD, which is, as you probably know, generally defined as being bounded by the freeways, Harbor on the west, Hollywood on the north, Golden State on the east, and Santa Monica on the south, because of the nature of the study in terms of intercepts related to regional inputs. By that I mean freeway-oriented traffic. The intent is to get people, essentially to get people out of their cars as much as possible in terms of long-range and short-range transportation systems, which would include freeway buses, a possible starter line, and intercepts of automobiles. If you don't allow the people the freedom to bring their cars into the CBD, creating the kinds of congestion that we've had in the past and the deterioration of the environment, you have to have some method of getting people around, either to their jobs or to the cultural centers or retail, or the circulation, so to speak, within the CBD itself. The little corner up there that's outlined in black within the CBD is Bunker Hill, and this is how the study started. A little background on that. About 3 years ago, Bunker Hill, with their complete design for development, had projected some 30,000 plus cars that would result from their total design for development, recognizing that would pretty well congest that whole program, that whole section up in the part of the CBD. Did a study with VTN that involved an automobile intercept up on the Hollywood freeway in the area of Westlake, which is north and west of the Bunker Hill area. They projected a people mover that would go from a 4,000 car garage adjacent to the Hollywood freeway through Bunker Hill to an east terminal around Los Angeles and 4th Street, where there would be a similar 4,000 car garage which would intercept people coming in from the east side. This people mover was projected as being a fixed guideway, exotic type hardware thing, and the study died for a number of reasons. Number one being there wasn't the development to go with it. Number two, the agencies who were involved or who were interested in transportation studies, meaning the city planning department, the city engineering, SCI-Arc and so forth, felt it was a very limited study in terms of taking care of the needs for the central business district, rather than just Bunker Hill. And more important to us, and I think to this group, is that the study was made by engineers without any concern for the impacts within the community, in terms of environmental impacts, in terms of social impacts, economic impacts, or what benefits could be derived from the system in terms of the communities, etc. Traditionally, transportation systems, including freeways and starter lines and what have you, have been done by engineers without these concerns. I think in the last few years we've seen evidence of what happens when the people rise and stop freeways, transportation systems, etc., because the engineers have taken the shortest point, so to speak, the most economical point, or line between point A and point B, without measuring any of the impacts or ramifications, except to carve up little pieces and give them to an urban designer to try to make something of. With all that as background, the Community Redevelopment Agency, who is sensitive to community needs because of neighborhood rehabilitation, etc., and all of the needs of communities, felt that what was needed in here was a lead team that was primarily made up of urban designers, planners, if you will. And we spring out of this field of architecture and have, as Ray has explained, over a period of years, we've sprung out of the field of architecture because of our concern for community, and we ended up as so-called urban designers and planners. I think it's very encouraging to find that transportation and all of its impacts on land use, social concerns and so forth is now being addressed by people, or people are being hired to look at these concerns, and not just in terms of moving people. About a year ago, the Community Redevelopment Agency asked a group. Let me back up a minute. You can, I guess, appreciate what the ramifications of a circulation distribution system does in terms of the city politically. I think Rex spoke about this the last time he was here, or perhaps mentioned on it. But it's incredible the amount of players that you get involved when you get into an urban scene of this kind of density. Just to name a few, you've got the city planning department, the city engineers, the county, you've got the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCI-Arc, you have the feds in here because there's probably federal money in here, the Urban Mass Transit Association, or administration, I mean to say. At any rate, the list just goes on and on and on. The Redevelopment Agency and SCRTD, most important, because they're the guys who will implement any transportation. The CRA is not in the business of implementing transportation. The CRA asked a study group from all of these agencies to determine whether there really was a need for a transportation system in the central business district, depending on some givens. The givens, or I shouldn't say the givens, the futures, or alternate futures. Those being a regional transportation system, either a starter line or a regional bus system, to a parking policy, or parking management policy. This came about approximately 2 years ago. Particularly the crunch of it was when there was an energy crisis and people were concerned about alternate means of transportation other than their own cars. And in addition, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Administration, was talking about reducing smog and the congestion, and there was a mandate that went out at that time for all cities to create parking management. The third input into this thing, into the futures into this thing is the growth or no growth of central business districts, or of the region, so to speak, and it's being a very controversial thing. This group met in what was called a 90-day study. They took 9 months to determine, yes, the central business district circulation distribution system study was in order, in spite of all the previous studies that have been going on transportation, and it would be a good thing to pull this whole thing together. At which point, we took off on this study with the intent the declared intent to produce not one scheme, but 3 schemes, 3 alternatives for political decision makers to consider for implementation of the CDS, or circulation distribution system in LA. The intent, of course, or the objective, was to reduce congestion in downtown LA, provide an easy transportation circulation within the district, and also, in doing so, to improve the total environment of the central business district and the city core, if you will, of the region. We started off in a first phase which included goals and objectives, an establishment of goals and objectives, at which point we recommended, and a citizens panel was formed, citizens advisory panel, was formed in this first phase, the first 8 weeks, that consisted, by the time the first phase was completed, they participated in the goals and objectives of approximately 125 people, interested citizens. Second part of the first phase was to establish our database, what was available. At this point, I might mention that we were under certain ground rules on this study, one being that we would use available data, that we would not generate new data. It just wasn't possible within the limitations of the study. And secondly, and more importantly, to us, and I guess to the people involved, was that we would not change the adopted central city plan. Like it or not, there was enough flexibility in there, we felt, that we could live with it. But the intent was not to change basically the central city plan. This is an important thing. And what we did, the central city plan, in case you don't know, was the one that Wallace McHogg did in the Silver Book, and then it was modified by the council and finally adopted by the redevelopment agency. The third thing that we did in that first phase was to establish what we call the study design, or try to project in detail, task by task, what we would be doing in the first phase. I would like to be able to say that we've come here today with the solution, or the direction for the solution. We started off, have tried to maintain objectivity, which we're still trying to maintain. We're at a phase, not quite as Ray mentioned, halfway through. We've completed a first phase in the second part, which is primarily a compilation of data and a synthesis of data. So what you'll be looking at today primarily is not any solutions to this thing, but a process that we've gone through related to all this data input. And I think it's an interesting process, particularly in retrospect when I think of how we normally work as architects. We work sort of as a combination of intuition, but with a rationale process in our heads. We don't put these things down for the most part. Although hopefully at school here I've noticed that there is a rationale, a documented rationale as you go through. When you get into a complex problem as this, with as high an accountability as what we have, and you can appreciate the accountability because not only has a citizens group been set up, but the same public agencies I mentioned before, who are all concerned with the ramifications of the transportation system, have been set up in what's called a study and review group. We meet with them every 2 weeks and account to them what we've done for their input. We meet with the citizens group at least once a week. They have set up special steering committees related to social concerns, related to assessment of the technologies that we might be using here, et cetera, et cetera. So as I mentioned before, we have a very high accountability, and stuff is constantly being put out and responded to coming on back.
You set up a study in the
The city, all of the agencies involved. This was set up by the Community Redevelopment Agency, but it involves approximately 12 to 14 different agencies, including SCI-Arc. I think at this point we can...
You might mention that, is that our suggestion really that some of the citizens would get involved with
oh, yes.
CDC.
Right.
Maybe that's what Jerry was trying to point out, because we've sometimes discussed where, what is the architect's role in some of this kind of decision-making rather than trying to avoid it.
Right. Good point. We were concerned that citizens groups did not have the technical know-how to deal with this kind of a problem. We were concerned that the citizens groups' efforts be channeled in as constructively as possible into the planning process. And we recommended to the agency that they engage as part of the consulting team, but independent of us, two advocacy groups, the Barrio Planners and the Community Design Center. And they were hired on by the agency, and their role is to monitor our efforts and to assist the citizens in projecting their creative input into this study in a way that we can communicate back and forth. It's been a really good relationship. It hasn't been, we don't consider this an adversary role, we consider it a supporting role. At this point I'll kind of switch over to some of the stuff that that's going into, or the synthesis of data, and then I'll demonstrate what we did with all these balls that we finally all these variables in order to get down to a framework for this transportation system. So if we can get the slide projector going, yeah. Is it on? You're right, Dean. Thank you. Getting down to, or starting this thing off, as I mentioned before, was the requirements of Bunker Hill. And since it's being funded off of the Bunker Hill tax increment funds, this, in a sense, was the driving force. What you're looking at is three projections of growth. One of the many variables that we have going in here. A task force was set up to try to resolve what levels of growth we should be working with in the central business district. There had never really been agreement within the city. The Wallace-McHogg projected some 390,000 employed persons central business district. There had never been agreement as to even what was existing. So a special task force was set up that included City Planning Department, SCAG, and a number of other agencies, worked for 2 months to determine what the levels of growth could be for this study. The first thing they determined that they agreed upon was that the existing level was 200,000 persons employed. Beyond that, we never did get any consensus as to what growth should be. We got a consensus that would permit the study to go ahead with a maximum growth of 290,000 at the upper limit and a mid-range growth of 230,000. With that in mind, we distributed amongst these alternatives into Bunker Hill and what that would represent in terms of a distribution into Bunker Hill. The pies represent the no growth, the moderate growth, and the high growth. Starting within the study area, we went through the whole projection of land use. Again, because of the limits of the study area related to intercepts, we felt it was important to project, particularly with the experience of the Westlake experience where none of this had been considered, the compatibility of land use with the transportation system. We went through the process of land use, which included the breakdowns of residential into low, low, medium, medium, high, high, and very high. Went through the commercial and broke it down into highway-oriented, neighborhood and office, community, and regional center specialized. The land use and open space And as we all might suspect, we purposely projected this being usable public open space, and as we might suspect, it hardly registers on the map. And the land use industrial.
Is all that use industrial or just zone?
This is all, okay, let me back up a minute. In keeping with our promise that we would use existing data and also the projected plans, we use the community plans, the Central City Adopted Plan, and all of the peripheral community plans. And there are approximately 9 communities in here. And their plans were used. There was a Westlake community, there was a Northeast section, there was a South Central section, there was a Silver Lake section. We took all of these community plans, combined them into this, their intent as they saw it within these community plans. So in a sense, these are not zoning plans, but general plans for those areas. Or, if you will, futures as the community plans have developed. We also projected all of the community facilities within the CBD and in the peripheral communities. And the whole list, as you can see, is on the right-hand side, again compiled from all of these community plans. If you have any questions as we go along, just sing out. Okay, along with that, we also, in the peripheral communities, barrio planners did this job for us. They went out and projected what they felt were the activity centers in these peripheral communities in terms of neighborhood shopping, libraries, junior colleges, recreational schools, etc. Again, an attempt that when we go into we didn't know at this particular time whether we would have transportation in the peripheral communities. Although there was an intent or an expressed desire on the part of the Citizens Advisory Group that we combine the central business district transportation system, aimed primarily at the regional commuter. But if we were to have intercepts out in the peripheral communities, to try to locate them not only in terms of the least disruption to the neighborhood, but also of possible benefit to the transit dependents in the peripheral communities. Okay, we can spin through this relatively fast. We took the ranges of 200, 230, and 290,000 and projected. I'll back up here a minute. I didn't talk about the group or the multidisciplinary group that's working on this study. I did mention that we were the lead group. Along with ourselves, we have a economist. We have transportation planners or computer modeling, transportation planning. We have engineering related to exotic types of technology, if we get into them, and we also have traffic engineers. The economists distributed, in accordance with existing trends, both the population and employment distribution in the central business district in order to determine where the population and employment would go. This is 75 existing. You can see this is based on densities, with the darker colors being the higher densities. Population distribution, low 1990, not much of a change except up in toward Bunker Hill and just around Little Tokyo. The mid-range, more concentration fill-in in Bunker Hill and Little Tokyo, some coming in South Park area. And the distribution 1990 begins to fill in more in the South Park area, the Little Tokyo, and East Alameda and the Bunker Hill area. The maximum, well, I shouldn't say maximum, the intent of the redevelopment agency is to encourage as much population in the central business district as possible. There are no limitations. This is the intent to bring more viability, more mixture into the central business district, and of course includes a higher population. The figure that was determined to work toward for 1990 was 40,000. The existing figure is 15,000 and declining very sharply. Going into employment distribution, you can see primarily in 75 it's in the government center, and also on the west side the Arco Towers and through the 7th Street corridor, retail corridor. The change in distribution is all headed primarily toward the west, more fill-in in government. It's unbelievable that government keeps expanding. More financial district over to the left side, and the general trend to the mid and to the high is a trend away over to the left-hand side. The attempt of all of this stuff, I should mention, is to establish, all this background data is plotted to establish where people will be going, or if you will, to establish service nodes or points of distribution, both for the present and for the future. This is within the CBD. We also took surveys within the CBD related to minibus origin and destinations, so that we were able to tell, have a better feel of how people circulated at noontime, which is a different type of circulation than it is a distribution, which is the incoming work traveler or a person coming in to shop from the peripheral communities into the central business district. Okay, this is a regional input. Regional input, the SCAG short range, and it might turn out, if there wasn't a starter line, that it might be a long range transportation system. A lot of people have felt, ourselves included, to keep not being quite so neutral. But the freeways do represent very strong corridors of travel, whether it be by automobile, and if we're going to get people out of automobiles, and we're getting into some other form of transportation. Initially, perhaps bus, perhaps farther on down the line as technology evolves, we might be getting into personal rapid transit on electric, buried electric wires, resistance coils, et cetera, the sky is the limit. But that the corridors of travel would be essentially on the freeways. This is the first alternative to be looked at in terms of regional input related to the freeway bus. The numbers of buses that you see coming off of each freeway was Caltrans, the old Division of Highways, projections of what 1990, 330,000 employed population could bring into the central business district. That's 110 buses peak hour coming in on Hollywood, 110 on Santa Monica, 70 from Harbor, and you can read the rest around. Now the question is, there is an existing bus distribution coming off of the San Bernardino right now from El Monte. The bus is presently self-distributing, as they call it, downtown. That means, to be a little more clear, is that the bus comes off of the freeway and distributes its passengers in the central business district. Now, if you can appreciate that you might have a regional total system in through here, if you had a self-distribution system of the buses coming into town where you could load and overload and congest and pollute the central business district, no end with all of these buses all barreling around downtown. The attempt here then was to explore intercepts where the regional bus system, persons coming in, would be transferred from an intercept to this circulation distribution system, which would be of a better environmental character and give a better distribution in the downtown section than what would be on a self-distribution. Yeah.
Explain exactly what you mean by peak hours. 110 buses per peak hour. Does that mean that in 1 hour?
That's correct. Right. Which is like every 30 seconds.
Los Angeles bus station is still in operation, private lane on the freeway.
Which one? The El Monte? Yeah, that's still in operation.
That lane's solely for the bus is still in operation.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting to go out and look at that operation. There are two stations out there that I found quite interesting. One at the County Medical Building and the other one at East LA College, and how they bridged over and how they handled the whole thing. Cal State, right. Yeah. And the other one, the terminal out in El Monte is quite a nice little terminal. There's 8 buses that spin around the circle out there. There's an underpass coming in underneath the whole thing. You come up on escalators. The graphics are well done. I was really amazed about the whole thing.
Dean, why don't you run those back a minute while we're talking about this?
That is the El Monte terminal. This is an SCRTD operation. If the freeway bus thing was to go through, we would see more of these on the other freeways. Now, the Santa Monica exclusive lane was supposed to have started last June. Because of operational difficulties, it was canceled. It was supposed to go on in, I think, this fall. It was canceled again, but I think they've got a fixed start now on that lane, on the preferential lane on Santa Monica, starting next March. The station? There aren't any stations projected. There is going to be a park and ride in Santa Monica at Cloverdale, I think, at SDS parking lot. Depending on how the program moves, and stations could possibly come on in. All right, what we did here was explore approximately 19 potential intercepts. We did this job with Division of Highways, or Caltrans, in exploring the ease of access of the buses to particular terminal points. What emerged out of this, this 19 did not mean that we were going to incorporate all 19. It was an attempt to look at all of them and then to go back and evaluate with all of the other factors that are involved in here as to which ones would be the most feasible. Again, related to service nodes. Which ones will we pick up on? In doing this task, at least two and possibly three intercepts emerged as being perhaps prime ones. Number one being at Union Station. Union Station being a underutilized potential multi-transportation center, not only for buses but also for the starter line. Number two, the convention center. Again, underutilized, large amounts of parking, plenty of room for freeway buses, and an intercept which would take care of the Santa Monica. Union Station could accommodate almost everything coming in from Hollywood, Pasadena, Golden State, and also San Bernardino, a large area back of the station. The third potential is the number 8, which is underneath the Hollywood freeway, which could intercept the Santa Ana and Pomona freeways. What the regional buses would do at these intercepts would be up to the most efficient way of using buses. The buses could continue, for example, coming from Pomona on out to Santa Monica, could also turn around and go back. If you wanted to travel, say, from Pomona to North Hollywood, at this intercept or terminal, you could transfer a bus to the Hollywood freeway bus, which would then take you on out regionally out to North Hollywood, right?
So your major criteria for locating your intercept was availability of land?
No, there were about 9 criteria that we used related to this evaluation. It included the accessibility to and from the freeway. It included the impacts in the neighborhoods, if there were impacts in the neighborhoods. It included the cost of potential guideway from the intercept to the CBD. It included the running time or approximate time to get from those areas of the intercept into the CBD. I can't quite recall all 9, but there are about 9 evaluation factors that we used in all of these intercepts. Okay, the next big input, or potential input into the CBD is the starter line. And as we all know, this is still not a resolved issue. I was down at RTD yesterday, and it's amazing how many people are involved in this effort without really knowing where anybody's going, because the decision makers are on top of the whole thing. The technical people and the planners are doing their best, but some of these things are wiped aside by the politicians and the decision makers. But presently, what's projected as the most feasible thing, or at least what they've agreed upon, when I say feasible, feasibly politically, and there's lots of caveats to that, is the Union Station to Long Beach line. there are all kinds of reasons why that comes in, why Long Beach comes in, because Long Beach has Prop 5 funds or gas tax monies that can be utilized as a share related to gathering UMTA funds. The CBD also, or the City of LA also would have, and although the patronage is not necessarily the greatest nor the greatest area to be served, this is the area they're presently looking at. Another reason being that they couldn't agree, the city and the county, on how to come in from the valley as to whether they came down through Glendale, Burbank, or as the city was pushing down through Coinga Pass and subway down through Wilshire into the CBD. At any rate, this was the 5 stations that SCI-RTD first projected as their minimum stations in the Central Business District. Since then, that's Union Station, 1st and Spring for the Government Center, 4th and Flower for Bunker Hill, 8th and Figueroa for the Financial Center, and the Convention Center, and on out down to the Coliseum. They've since backed off on this. There are all kinds of problems. Number one being their operation is presently projected to tunnel and not open up the streets. And therefore, their engineers are projecting they'll be down approximately 110 feet deep, which presents small problems like how do you get from 110 feet deep hole up to the surface. Obviously, you can't take escalators, so you're in effect looking at a high-rise building in reverse, and you would need many banks of high-speed elevators. This is fine if, in a sense, you're coming in on a commuter system and you have a destination point, let's say at 8th and Figueroa, and you walk a few blocks to work. It doesn't work too well, let's say, though, at a noon hour if you want to get to Government Center. You're not going, or it's unlikely that you're going to go down 110 feet, go 2 stations over, and come back up 110 feet to get over there. So it doesn't really work all that well as a distribution, as a circulation system. They've backed off, as I mentioned before, and have now thrown the station locations, or say they've thrown the station locations into the lap of our particular program. However, what they do say is they've got to get the most bang for their bucks, and couldn't justify a regional system unless they had at least 2 stations in the CBD that related to activity centers. This is one of the many variables that we're talking about, yeah. Why is it that deep? In order to tunnel without, to avoid all of the utilities, right, and without opening up the streets. That's what they told us, 110 feet, yeah.
Long Beach starter line was going to go through the south central areas, Los Angeles, and that it would serve the lowest partially income area, so that the people who don't have adequate transportation can get into the downtown center.
That's a legitimate political rationale for that, yes.
Because the Wilshire corridor plan was really a higher income, would serve a much higher income area.
Right. At any rate, in looking at what we're doing, we, again, related to these futures, what we have to project in 1990 is, number one, is there a starter line, or will there be a starter line? The uncertainty of even where it's going, but there's more uncertainty as whether there will be a starter line, whether anybody will accept the starter line. So we have to look at the potential of yay, a starter line, or nay, a starter line, and project the transportation system with those 2 things in mind.
About a week ago, there was I thought a total agreement among all the agencies that would be the line, that both lines going to the valley. Wasn't that?
There was total agreement, yes, I thought so too. But I find out now there's total agreement to do the technical analysis necessary to get it to an UMTA application. When they've completed the technical analysis, including all the patronage, the costs, and so forth, everyone is reserving judgment as to whether that's the best thing to go ahead with or not. So it's an agreement with so many caveats as to make a no agreement.
Have they thought about using the LA River mouth? I know it runs directly to Long Beach, but the LA River.
Well, us in our simplistic, like you're thinking, say to SCRTD every once in a while, why are you developing new rights-of-way? You've got the LA River that runs from Chatsworth all the way to Long Beach. And why not take advantage of it? And they shrug their shoulders and they say, but there are no population centers anywhere near the river bed. And we say, but one of the purposes of a transportation system is to provide the framework for a reorientation of distribution of population. But they're not worried about that. They're worried about how many people are going to ride this thing. And land use is not one of the major considerations. They're just looking for bodies.
So in order to be politically safe, that thing has to be at capacity the day it opens.
That's correct.
And
Right.
they don't want to use it as a building tool.
That's right. And you know, all of the government agencies, including UMTA and all whatever funding would be involved in that, go along with that. They still haven't come around to the recognition that transportation is a major driving force in terms of implementing a distribution of densities and population to reassemble your land use, so to speak. Now, I mean, a classic example of this, yesterday at SCRTD, they had a good presentation, and it might be available if you try to get it to school, of the Toronto, what Toronto did and their transportation system for their land use, and how it shaped the city.
It would seem that the major banking institutions would be
Favorable to locating transportation in like the virgin land areas because they can make the most potential profit out of that. Because they'll be the basic financiers of bonds and individual mortgages.
Right.
And since one of the major banks is in cahoots with an oil company, it would seem that they'd be fronting that proposal.
It's hard to fathom sometimes, I think. Okay, going on, this is what we call miscellaneous transit, and it includes airport transit, the Union Station Amtrak, and there's been talk about increasing suburban travel from Laguna Beach, Orange County, etc., better utilization of Amtrak. The Greyhound bus and the SCRTD terminal, that designation over the C, and finally the Continental Trailways Depot. The bus depot, SCRTD and Greyhound bus depot, is an interesting potential in terms of when we start looking at the potential of Union Station being a multimodal transportation center. There have been studies done by the city related to a transportation center at Union Station. It's a hot issue within the city as to whether it is or it isn't. The existing terminal in terms of SCRTD is over on the east side where the population and employment have all moved away in the last umpteen years. It's a declining use of a terminal. Whether a terminal is a valid thing or not is not provable by the location of that existing station over there, a terminal. Okay, these represent just very fast the percentages of freeway travel, which on freeway into the CBD in terms of work trips is about 76% of the total. 16% come in on, 10% come in on the Wilshire corridor, roughly described as 6th, Wilshire, Olympic, and possibly Pico, and approximately 6% come in from the south on the Alameda. This was done in an attempt to define, other than intercepts related to freeways, where potential intercepts might be related in the peripheral communities, if the peripheral communities determine the need for their transportation system from the peripheral communities into the CBD, besides the excuse of the regional commuter. This was generally the flows of the traffic in off of the streets, combined with what we called peripheral parking. Now I have to stop here a moment to talk about parking policy, because here's another element or another variable or alternative that we're looking at. Related to parking management, the City of LA was supposed to have set up a parking management program which has not gotten into gear. We would, to utilize what they generated off of this parking management thing as input into the study. They have done nothing and have deferred to our study with reserving the right to comment on what we've done. Okay, our parking policy task is spun off to the point at this particular point. We're not completed. What we did was a review of allocation, demand, surpluses, and deficiencies of existing parking. We projected that reallocation, deficiencies, and surpluses into a growth pattern of 1990, both mid and high, and came up with 3 parking potential parking policies, or a combination of the 3. One being what we call existing trends, which is you just park. Building department requires so many cars related to any new development. Obviously not a policy that would promote the kind of goals that this particular transportation system is endeavoring to do. Secondly, what's called a fringe parking. And thirdly, which we'll get to in the next slide, and thirdly, a peripheral parking, or keep all the parking out of the CBD, utilize it to intercept cars, and also utilize as potential nodes for a transportation system that could go out and serve the peripheral community as well. This was, again, related to transit dependency in terms of auto intercepts or points to be served outside of the CBD. What we did here was a compilation of what we call transit need values, and included, we did, it's a compilation meaning an index, and the inputs into it was the percentages of household with no ownership, people over 65, the percentage of work trips by bus, and the percentages of families below poverty level. The darker areas indicate the areas of higher transit dependency, and as they fade out, there are less transit dependency. The fringe parking, again, these sites, if I might back up a minute, these sites were gone out and looked at and evaluated in similar kinds of terms as what we did in the freeway bus, in an attempt, before we married the whole thing together, to pick up these service nodes, or the ones that might potentially be available or that would serve in this bus distribution system. This is not intended as we're serving all of those nodes. It's an input related to the compilation of all of these factors I've been talking about, and then theoretically we're going to come up with service nodes. These are areas we identified as fringe parking. We tried to pick areas without acquiring a lot of expensive right-of-way. We looked at all the potential freeway locations underneath the freeway and the potentials of possibly over the freeway. Again, related to service and where people want to go. We looked at the distribution of population and employment in order to get the concentrations as to where people's destinations would be. Another important factor is the activity centers within the CBD, both now and as best as we could guess they would be projected. We categorized here, I think, some 45 or 48 activity centers. We attempted by phone, well, we first tried to get the information from the city planning department or any sources that we could get as to the extent of, or the magnitude of the activity centers in order to quantify them. This was interesting because nobody had anything. So it turned out to be a bigger job. This was one task that we did not take available data to determine, but we made our own data. And took a lot longer with this particular test than we had originally anticipated. We phoned almost all of the places that we could. The ones that we couldn't get in contact with, we made gross estimates and quantified all of these activity centers related to annual participation. The largest one by far, by 8 or 9 times than anything else, was the Broadway, 7th Street, lineal retail section, as you might guess. The other ones were Dodger Stadium, Alvera Street, and these are all just barely over $1 million. The Broadway 7th Street corridor was approximately, came out at over $9 million per year. We also took some, like in Bunker Hill at the Bonaventura, and estimated those to be approximately $750,000 to $1 million. The ones that we found in a range of over $750,000 we felt could potentially become major activity centers in 1990, and designated the dark red ones as the major activity centers as potential nodes to be served. And lastly in this group here is what turns out to be a very efficient circulation system in the CBD right now. For those of you who might have ridden it, it's not very comfortable, but it really gets you around as the existing minibus. We could conceivably have, with all of this study, no more of a circulation distribution system in the CBD, depending on the decisions that are made, for example, on all of these alternatives, depending on the growth. We could have no more in 1990 of a distribution system, no circulation, than the minibus or an expanded minibus or a more comfortable minibus. Now, what do we do with all this mess? I mean, we've thrown a lot of balls up in the air, and now what we have to do is, in a sense, synthesize it and try to bring it down into some kind of a framework that we can take off in order to find these three candidates that we were talking about, or these three alternatives. Our next process, and I'll show you the synthesis of this material, is to get down to develop what we call alternative combinations. Out of a framework that we've projected, we will now develop various kinds of combinations of both routes, station locations, applied technology, you name it, evaluate all 12 related to all of the impacts, including urban design, economics, social considerations, travel, demand, patronage, etc., in order to get down to the three. We'll do this relatively grossly, but with sufficient data to be able to make these evaluations. When we select, along with the concurrence of all of the people who are watching us, the final three candidates, we will then do a very detailed study on those three, which will include all of the goodies, as I describe them, in terms of urban design related to transportation, the potentials of plazas and pedways and landscape, etc., related to this transportation system. We'll do a detailed analysis of the whole financial package of the costs and operating of the system. That's starting off approximately in mid-January. Our next phase is to develop these alternatives, 12 or 14, in order to evaluate and get down to the three. But to get back to all of this stuff that we've thrown up in the air, am I going to trip on you? And I'll get back to, first of all, the problem existed as to how to look at this stuff and how to account to people and explain our process. We came up with these Mylar overlay, a la Wallace McHogg method. I can't see these little dots, but I'll try to get as close as I can. Here we are looking at, obviously, if we do have an MRT, potential nodes that would be taking off, or a distribution from those particular nodes to the remainder of the CBD. I'm going to pull these things off, and in the end I'm going to sandwich the whole mess together to show you how we finally got to where we got. I've tried in a number of presentations to build up this sandwich until it got to the area of such confusion that people said, "Wow, I didn't understand what you were doing." So our communication process in here, at this particular point in time, leaves a little bit to be desired. Okay, here is our distribution. This is a little sandwich here. of a distribution of, can you see the colors? Does it read? Okay. We tried it by a zip, and the zip didn't work, so in the charrette session we had with the whole team, I'm in your way, aren't I? A charrette session we had with the whole team, why the zip wasn't reading, so we colored the stuff so it could read. The red indicates the concentrations of employment. The yellow indicates the concentrations of population. The blue circles indicate the heavy activity centers within the CBD. Again, this is an attempt to build up to find out where the circulation distribution system should go. This was, what you're looking at here is a 1990 high growth projection. We took the maximum condition to work towards. When we, in order to find out what series of concepts might be evolved out of this mess, and then work back down into the mid-range growth distribution and also the low range to see if our system or systems would hold up. Okay. The next one to look at, or that we looked at, was the inputs of traffic and both the freeway bus and the auto intercept locations. The circles represent the freeway bus. The squares represent auto intercept. We tried to find locations where they could coincide, which made sense to us because if you're going to intercept with circulation distribution, if you can pick up people both on buses and people that have parked there, you've accomplished two things with one particular node. This represents the compilation of those two things plus the surface street traffic coming in. And then added on top of that, we have, and I'll start sandwiching here now, the peripheral garages as well within the CBD, as well as the ones on the periphery. All right, I'll take this whole mess now and sandwich it. I will try to. Okay, in order to arrive, can't see it all, can you? Okay, I guess I'm going to have to strip off here and get back to basics. Okay, what we did with all of that, as we sandwiched, we evaluated all of the freeway bus intercepts. We had evaluated them in the task itself, each one of them, related to the criteria I mentioned before. Also, the auto intercepts we evaluated in the same way. We took the most promising ones in the process of this charrette I mentioned, colored them in to identify them as selecting the service nodes that we would serve, and then built up through the process of looking at land use, the compatibility of the land use in here, the relationship of the concentrations of employment and population, the concentrations of activity centers, particularly along the Broadway corridor there, and came up with this, which we call the CDS framework, or if you will, the just corridors. And not, people have already misinterpreted by the thickness of our line as this being a fixed guideway or what have you. They've already in their own minds applied a technology. We have not applied a technology to these things. These are just broad corridors with the potentials of picking up these alternative futures, as we're talking about. There's nothing to say that there will be freeway bus terminals. There's nothing to say that there will be an automobile parking policy. However, and there's nothing to say there will be an MRT. However, all of these things are potential futures, and the validity, hopefully, of this framework or corridor is that as a policy is affected, that a service node begins to make sense within a network. And this is the framework for, or the corridors for, a full-blown network. In terms of implementation, as part of the 3 candidates we'll be looking at for what is the most promising leg of implementation in order to start off this whole process, and that eventually that the initial leg would fit into this framework given all of the futures that are coming on. I think at this point I'm going to stop and take all the questions you want to throw at me. Yeah.
The lower right-hand extension corridors is cutting diagonal against the street pattern. Would that be suggesting a guideway?
No. Again,
Because
this process of communication.
I know what you said before, but for a vehicle, a surface vehicle to function in a diagonal corridor to the street pattern, would be making right-hand turns every other block.
Correct. This
To
is
make it
not,
efficient.
okay, let me try to clarify. I had the same problem with SCAG the other day with Bill Ackerman. He saw this line running diagonally across Bunker Hill against the street pattern, and he says, I don't understand that. And I'll give you the same answer in terms of, this represents a link between here and here, and how it gets there, we're not specifying in this chart. If we were to do a surface thing or a fixed guideway, we would be either working with the street pattern or what would be the most available and easiest right-of-ways. Other criteria being in effect in terms of potentials for future development, for example, in that corner in terms of industrial uses and new industrial uses is, for example, the Wallace McHarg would like to promote on the Central City Plan, Hollywood Freeway, and then suddenly you go off the freeway in order to get to that intercept. It's purely a graphic thing that Dean Noda put tape on the on the drawing in order to represent a link, and a link only. Yeah.
Is what you're saying that between those 2 points there is going to be communication, whether it's, what the kind of communication as far as cars or trucks or whatever, it doesn't really matter. So what you're saying though is that somehow those two are going to be linked with a transportation link, whether they have to go on the city streets to get from one point to the other.
Correct. We're not saying, for example, well, number one, we've got all kinds of qualifications. The dotted lines, for example, particularly are alternatives to the solid lines. Or are, for example, if this is to be determined to be overloaded, or if it is determined that we want to promote a better land use in this area, this has the potential to be added onto the network. It might not be in the first flush of the network. Secondly, we have not, again, determined what technology these lines will be. This will be part of this whole alternative combinations. Our next task from this point on here now is to, number one, assess available technologies. Second, to apply alternative technologies to these particular links, to look at these links and say, what is the advantage of using a guideway here? What is the advantage of using a bus here? What is the advantage of pulling a horizontal pedway here? What is the advantage of using a monorail or gondolas or whatever the hell in terms of what these links might be? That's our next phase of that. Right.
Are you working at all with any of the city councilmen or closely with them, or any of the decision-making people? Okay,
for the most part, the study and review group is made up of all interested participants from city, county, SCAG, Alter, and so forth. We have been getting, you might call their low-level representation, or field people. Same way at a city planning department. Cal Hamilton is not there, but someone farther on down the transportation section is there. It's a whole process that we hope all of these lower level representatives are taking back to the higher level to keep them informed. There will be a couple of points of major review. The main point will be when we get down from the 12 alternatives down to the 3 candidates that will be looking at detail. There will be a major review of that. But meanwhile, meshing very closely with SCRTD, and because number one, their application to UMTA, which is a grant application, is going in with this system as a single package, because if they don't have, the feds are interested, if you bring all these people into the region and you don't have a way of distributing them to their employment, you have only a half a system. So what are you doing in the central business district? So this will be a part of the federal grant, whatever we have, related to what they're coming in with, and they're developing 9 alternatives. Our 3 alternatives have to be responsive to their 9 alternatives as well.
What about, besides CDC and barrio planners, what about other community groups? Are they having any input into what's happening?
Definitely. When this framework came out, one of the first things that we pointed out was that number one, we were impacting, and I should move that over because it should be closer to the freeway. I guess that's a little better. Number one, we were impacting the Westlake community up in there with both a bus and a parking intercept. That particular square and circle does not represent, at this particular point in time, a precise location. There are a number of locations up in that area, some closer to the freeway than others, that we will be looking at in terms of being able to accommodate both buses and cars. But we are impacting the Westlake community not only with an intercept, but with a potential of a link from that intercept into the CBD going through a community. We also have the option from that particular point of coming down the freeway right-of-way, which Caltrans has been doing some work for us related to taking guideways or transportation systems down the medians of the freeways. But there is that potential. So, and there's also the potential we've identified of impacting the Pico Union area. We've asked barrio planners and the CDCs now to identify the concerned community groups to start a potential planning process in those community groups to identify, not to go into the community and say, we're coming in with this mother and we're going to really lay it on you, so what do you think about it? But rather to go into the community and say, if a transportation element is put into your community, there would be some trade-offs related to having this element in your community. Number one, you'll be getting some advantage out of being able to have access to the CBD. Now, that might not be terribly important to most of the people in the community, that their community needs are far greater than having access to the CBD. What are the needs in your community in terms of recreation, housing, etc.? And that potential redevelopment areas of 4 or 5 or 6 square blocks could be set up to offset whatever impact the transportation system might be in terms of meeting the needs of the community. Again, this would be a participatory, hopefully it will be a participatory planning process with the community and ourselves through barrio planners. Yeah.
You were talking earlier about the RTD going down the Los Angeles River, whatever it is, and how that the argument that you gave was that that they didn't want to use it, but the argument you gave was that that it would create new land use. How does what you establish now, is that based on existing land use or proposed land use, or is it kind of in between?
Well, this framework doesn't represent a in itself and through here, realizing that this framework corridors could be yay wide, doesn't represent a compatibility necessarily with or without land use. This would be, this compatibility in terms of proposed development would be developed at a finer grain than what's presently shown. So we've used it only in terms of initial locations or potential locations for these intercepts and determine the compatibility or non-compatibility of some of the intercepts. The ones that are shown are, for the most part, we feel could be compatible. Some of the ones that we're not looking at here now, but some of the freeway bus ones, for example, that were shown up in the area of Chavez Ravine and around Dodger Stadium in new multi-family residential areas, we determined as being incompatible with the land use up in there, and that's one of the reasons they were eliminated.
Depending on what comes first as far as these intercepts, could or if like the existing land development came about first and the intercepts were, you know, part of the plan that came in, you know, then it would work one way. But if you started to put in your intercepts first, then it would create possibly a different plan.
Agreed. The ideal that planners have worked toward is to establish your goals and objectives as how you want to shape your city. Do your general plans in conformance with your goals and objectives as how you want to concentrate, how you want to develop land use. Then use transportation as an implementation tool to realize your planning. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out that way because there are no tools or no mechanisms for implementation of land planning. It's an abstraction. It's drawn on a map, it goes in a drawer. City planning commissions sometimes do or don't make decisions based on those general plans. Transportation, though, is, if it is implemented, it does form the base. We're doing this backwards here now because that's the way it generally works. And we haven't found a mechanism to make it work the other way. Just as the freeways determined land use along their corridors, rather than the reverse way, there wasn't sufficient. So a transportation system such as this establishes the potential for land use. At every station location that you locate, you in a sense are creating the potential for a higher density of development, both in possibly residential and in commercial. The intent of this study would be to take advantage of the areas that would, in terms of the environment and in terms of desirable land use, those stations would be located in those areas that would be determined in the planning process as being the better locations for that. We will also be looking into the possibility of helping to pay for the system by the increased land value of the areas around the stations and the property owners being subsidized, being taxed, so to speak, because of that increased value that would go into the system. Did I answer your question?
What are you feeling about Back's Ward's proposal about using a rail system, which he says can be implemented tomorrow with Pasadena Union Station and El Monte Union Station, the San Fernando Valley Union Station, and Long Beach Union Station, using rail train systems as a starter?
Well, generally I'm simpatico to the idea of using existing right-of-ways, minimum capital expenditures in order to get as large a regional system as possible. There are problems to be overcome, as for instance, when I talked to the modeling cats over in Skag, and they sort of hooed at Baxter Ward's scheme, the problem, particularly out in the valley, is grade separations. You've got heavy north-south automobile traffic. This is all assuming, of course, that if you could get people out of their cars and onto transportation systems, it wouldn't create these kinds of problems. But if you've got people driving in cars and you're crossing, in a sense, you've got a conflict between the rail system and the automobile at the same grade, they were estimating these gates, these safety gates, was going up and down like this every time one of these cars went by, which were going by at about 20 to 40 second headways. So it isn't all quite as simplistic, you know, as what a politician would make it appear. Yeah.
Besides that tax increase you were talking about, what other finance frameworks are you considering as you're doing these physical plans, these general plans?
Okay. As part of the process of what I originally talked about with the study design, we outlined 76 various tasks related to pulling this thing together. The economist has about 4 or 5 tasks related to funding, and it includes the kind of potential funding I described before. What they call local funding, city, county participation in tax, either in tax assessment districts or a whole varied bag to be looked at. In terms of sales tax, what they call non-local funding, what they call private funding, and what they call federal funding. So he has like 4 or 5 tasks related to the potential of funding the system. Then along with that will be both capital and operating costs of this system here, and then the whole thing will be put into a financing package and broken down into a phased development of implementation and so forth. Hopefully when we get through with this study in May, there'll be all sufficient information related to almost any aspect as to be able to have someone make a decision other than just a political decision, that it would have a rationale all behind the whole thing. Yeah.
I understood that SP was not willing or not in favor of the idea of sharing their rights of way. Is that still the case now?
I really don't know. I think they do have some problems with sharing the rails where they're using for freight. The railroads are not interested, as you know, in passengers anymore, and that's why Amtrak came all about. The railroads are interested in fact, terribly concerned about all of their freight lines. So if it was an interference with their freight line, yeah, then they would be very guarded in their giving up those rights. Anybody else? If not, I guess that's our presentation for this morning, and hopefully in May I'll come back and give you the where we finally got to, if we get there. Thank you.
That in the center there is the metal foundry where the bronze bells are cast. That structure there is made out of segments, each of which is concrete reinforced with metal wire, small sections of like 1-inch long steel wire. It was an experiment.
I just put these in for comparison's sake. This is, of course, the Guggenheim Museum, and the center shot just shows its site. And
On the right is the cover over the swimming pool. I guess we have some shots of that later. That was cast on the ground on a mound of sand and hoisted into place with 12 telephone poles to support it. On the left is an apse structure, which is a way of responding to the sun. This one happens to face north. If it faces south, it will be in the interior will be in the shade during the summer and in the sun in the winter. So it's a way of capturing heat in the winter and shading in the summer. We have some more shots of those later on. This is a swimming pool. Arcosanti was developed, I guess, most of the construction went on between the late 50s and the late 60s. There hasn't been too much happening there since about 68 or 69. And we had some shots here from an exhibition that toured the United States. This was the opening exhibition at the Cochran Museum in Washington, D.C., 1969. On the right is a dam structure and 2 bridges. Another bridge in the center. This is all intended to be sculptural concrete. This is just for comparison's sake, Golden Gate. The last slides were apparently a model of one of Soleri's designs. He did a lot of designing of bridges during the 50s. He was really into experimenting with pure structure in that sense. A lot of these slides I've never seen before. Terry Glassman took a lot of these at the opening show in 1969.
This is again just a comparison to show some of the other work that was going on in the late 60s. This is the Sea Ranch, which was done by Moore, Linden, and Turnbull, and who were a group of Bay Area architects at that point. It was an attempt to respond to some of the historical things that were there, and also to the climate. I mean, it was designed in a wind tunnel, which was at that time a very forward step.
Okay.
Some more views of the Sea Ranch.
Yeah, go ahead, Chair.
Yeah, these were taken a few years after it was finished. It's kind of a comparative study of bridges. Soleri and his bridges try to really take things to the next level and not just build a pure structural solution, but to try to include housing and other sort of living units and more of a whole social structure. I mean, his feeling was that if you're going to put that much effort into a large project, that there should be more than just the functional aspects. And these are some other projects. I think perhaps the three major works of the 60s. In the center is the aerial view of the Salk Institute in La Jolla, and then on the left the Sydney Opera House by Jorn Utzon, and on the right Habitat 67. All of these projects were an attempt to find an expression for reinforced concrete and particularly pre-stressed concrete.
These sketches were out of the exhibit at the Concrete Museum, I believe. Soleri has file cabinets full of sketches like this. Do you know, Dave, was this part of the Mesa City project? You can see some of the apps forms here, bridge forms that Soleri's been using.
This is one of Soleri's satellite structures. It was supposed to be an orbiting satellite. Oh yeah.
Soleri's arcologies are self-contained cities, and he's been thinking along the lines of cities in outer space as well.
This is perhaps some of the spin-off from the space program, and there was a lot of energy in the late 60s, and I think Soleri was really tuning in on that energy when he began Arcosanti, began really thinking about Arcosanti. This is the Fuller U.S. Pavilion at Expo 67. And the German Pavilion, which was really one of the first really major tensile structures built in North America. Louder. This just kind of shows the three expressions of that period: the lunar module, the Fry Auto Pavilion, and the interior of the U.S. Pavilion. All really, I think, fragments of the same energy. And some more views of the Utzon Opera House. And the Salk Center. And some detailed views of Habitat 67.
These are some more shots coming up of the Cochrane exhibit. We're going to have a tape of Paolo Soleri here.
Roughly divided in discovery, in invention, in maintenance, and in creation. Very roughly, 4 categories. Well, what I did, if I did anything, it was to discover a little something, which was the idea that Don was explaining. And then maybe I went a step further. I invented something based on this discovery. But from there on, it's a free for all. I don't have any what do you call it, exclusive right to it. Anybody that wants to use this discovery and this invention can do it on its own, and it can be a person, can be a team, can be a very large team. I'm not suggesting that one person should discover, invent, and then create a city. The concentration we have now is not a planned concentration, it's a concentration that happened haphazardly. Somebody says because of economic laws, I would be very doubtful about it. If this is the economy, we better forget about it and start all over again with some other kind of semantic tricks. We don't have a concentrated humanity that really has the right instrumentality for this concentration. So we'll have to somehow find new ways of really concentrating the activity of man in a much higher level of organization, not to make him more regimented, but to make him freer, because I think we have to believe in planning. It's time that we believe in planning, because if we don't plan, we are not going to make it. My point of view is that socially we are very, very primitive. We are naive and primitive and fairly brutal. And whatever we are going to do from now on, is going to be just the moving from infancy to maturity as far as social texture and social integration and social sap. And I think that if we move in that direction, which seems to be the direction that life moves, then we are going to need those instruments which are serving us better. Well, in any step that has some radical aspect, you have to start with a small experiment, it seems to me, when we were going into space, we didn't start with the big booster. We started with a little thing going up a few hundred feet and watch it to see what happens. The same thing here. In this case, the problem is infinitely more difficult. So we should start with small undertakings and try somehow to verify some of those concepts. And by experiencing, not by simulation, but by experience, find out many things that we have to find out. And then if one of the systems or a couple of the systems starts to function, people would ask for more, because there is where life would be slightly more promising, and the reaching power of the citizen would be better attuned to his energies and so on. So at that point, life would start to transfer from the old pattern to the new pattern, and that's exactly what evolution does. I think if you think in terms of cosmic clocks, I mean, everything becomes very, very normal. The disappearance of Manhattan is a very puny phenomenon, extremely puny. And now and then we have to take it on that way, otherwise we cannot see the perspective of things. If we keep slicing history in very, very thin wafers, like 10 years, 5 years, 2 years because of political reasons, we don't know where we're going because there is no section that you can orient and say, well, this is how history moves. We have to take a slice of 500,000 years, 1 million years, 2 million years, then we can start to see how life goes. And then maybe we can guess, because as human beings, we are really making the future. Future is a reality just because we are thinking and reflecting creatures. So to talk about being utopian because you're looking too much into the future is total nonsense. Only by looking at the future you can make sense of what we are doing. Well, the skeleton is fairly strict. The meat could be quite malleable. It could change very, very much. You define a new topography, really. You don't define the city. It's like a new landscape. You are presented with a landscape which is not the flat landscape. It's a landscape made on many levels with the services, the potential logistics built into it. From there on, it's a free intervention of individuals, of groups, and so on.
See, the key here is that Paolo, or one man, and it may not be Paolo, because I don't think he's going to live that long enough to see one of them built, will provide the structural system. See? And in that structural system will be the plumbing system, that is all the services. And it's a three-dimensional street system, if you really want to call it that, so that it is no more constricting than our present-day city. But it is three-dimensional, and in that sense, it has that many more possibilities and directions to take.
But it has to be three-dimensional because it looks better. It has to be three-dimensional because that's where life can organize itself more intensely. It's really a problem of logistics. We can stir it and mix it and go on forever and ever. We come always down to the point that life is fundamentally a problem of logistics. And it's not being vulgar or being deterministic or being, functionalist or so. It's just that there is no phenomenon in the living world that is not a miracle of logistics. The city is going to be a living phenomenon someday, and the logistics of the city have to be solved if it's going to be that. And you cannot solve it on a flat plane. You have to solve it in the solid. And this is because of laws of nature, I mean.
What happened, Paul? It's a question that I have. For example, supposing that I was living in Babel Canyon upstairs, and I got together with a whole radial quadrant of people and decide to paint the entire radial section pink, and then hang Coca-Cola signs on the outside. And the thing that always bothers me is that although that there is a logistic about, and an evolutionary logistic about why this has to come about, what is going to preserve it from being a three-dimensional junkyard?
The fact that there is a quite a good discipline of the total system, of the skeleton. It's a little like having a beautiful girl and dressing yourself in funny clothing. It's still a beautiful girl.
Then we go back, though, to the other question, and that is, do you impose to a degree, a vision, a city that is immutable and permanent and
No, if I impose it, I am imposing it indirectly by the force, by the strength of the structure. If it's really good, it's going to tell people something very, very important. and possibly this would be important enough not to make them hang Coca-Cola signs. But if they hang Coca-Cola signs, as I said, it's a whimsical, or it's it's something that might be there today and might not be there tomorrow. But still, the fact remains that the creature, if it was beautiful at the beginning, it's still beautiful, even if it has a crazy way of dressing, a crazy way of presenting itself.
When arcology is built, it has to be something. The choice must be made on what it's going to look like. Now, you could say it's personal taste, you could say it may turn out to be beautiful, but if you're going to erect one of these $35 billion arcologies, I think that choice is not just personal taste.
Well, let me say again the analogy between the organism and those things. You might have the same kind of skeleton, and you might come up with a beautiful girl, or not a so beautiful girl. So the same thing, it might be there. You might have the same skeleton, but you might come up with the end product which can be quite beautiful, or you might end up with an end product which is just so-so. Because the feeling in the meat of the matter comes in those detailings that are very changeable.
Yeah, but are you advocating in the sense that when you detail out one of these arcologies, that mankind itself will have to become creative artisans in order for it to be beautiful?
If we are going to go into the age of leisure, we are going to have to make up our minds to become creatively leisurely, or as you were saying, slot men, or just mechanical robots. And if we choose to become more creative individuals, we have to find a way through education of doing this. And what's better than working on the cities in developing this kind of creative leisure? I mean, anyone can become its own master builder if he chooses to do that. If we are going if we keep going on in polluting and wasting and destroying, we are going to destroy us and the animal kingdom and the vegetable kingdom. You have a very good point. But you see, one of the reasons of having arcologies is that they would be much less pollutant, much less wasteful, and much less destructive.
Yeah, but you don't have to build a $35 billion city to get rid of the gas waste of an automobile. Because Ford is doing it now. Right?
That's where we are disagreeing. Right. The car is not a pollutant. The car is pollution. It would cure almost automatically many of the ills that are brought in by waste and pollution. That's not the reason why I suggest that we should do them, but that's one of the good reasons for doing them. See, there are reasons of maintenance and of health recuperation that tells us that we should go that way. Take care of the population explosion, take care of waste, take care of pollution, take care of segregation and other things. Those are all things that could be helped and cured by this behavior. But the reason why I'm suggesting this should be done is not maintenance, it's creation. Let's take Arcosanti, 4 main modular systems. One is in the apsis, one is in the columns, one is in the roof, and one is in the beam. Well, they're all different, so you have quite a bit of variety right there. And then once you decide which of those modular elements you are picking out, you can still get into it and subdivide it as you want, use the colors you want, use some of the material up to a certain degree that you want, and even define the interface between the inside and the outside as you want. So you really end up by having a mosaic, even from the outside, a mosaic surface, where you might have all sorts of colors, all sorts of materials, all sorts of texture, one near the other one. I think one of the great distinctions, again, between animal and man is the man is able to abstract thinking, is able to see, to grasp, and then to absorb, and then work those elements into conceptions. And this is really the nature of humaneness. If we eliminate this, we eliminate man again, because we eliminate everything that man has done that makes him different from the animal. So it seems to me that sooner or later we have to accept the fact that planning has a meaning, and also foresight, and also the ability to project and to extrapolate and so on. So why not have somebody, a team, a person, define this structure, and then let it develop by the introduction of life into it. But I don't think we can accept the idea that laissez-faire or free enterprise can go on in doing what has been doing now. It has failed socially in a total and dismal way. No, it's in the nature of the structure that we are choosing. If we choose to spread out, by necessity we are going to destroy what we are going to seek. We are seeking nature. What are we doing? We all seek nature. You seek it, I seek it, he seeks it. And then we go there and destroy nature because of the fact that of being there. We have to always think in terms of the fact that we are 3.5 billion. We are going to be 5 billion soon, maybe 6 or 7. And we cannot overlay on the biosphere this new crust of asphalt, etc., etc., etc. We cannot do that. That's going to just to cut life short. Because I see concentration as a positive element, not a negative element. See, the whole idea is based on the fact that concentration is not an evil that we have to submit to, is the grace that we are seeking. Concentration has created civilization. I mean, we couldn't imagine civilization and culture as such if we were just jumping from one branch to the next, as monkey do. I mean, for good and evil, what we have now is because the town, the village, the town, the city existed and produced what we have. So I don't think we can say that the city is the evil that we have to accept. I think the city is the epitome of what we should seek, that we have to find the right structure for it. Some other questions seems to be double. One is how we can move from one structure, from one system of life to the next, and the answer there is that this has happened from the beginning of life and will always happen. We'll always move from one kind of life to a next kind of life, which might resemble, not might resemble the preceding. The other one is that what I'm proposing is just to move from distances that have to be covered by a mechanical means to distances that can be covered by walking. And it's as simple as that. It seems to me that if life is at the end of his development and we are the end product, life is not worth living, because we haven't really got that great state of grace where we can say life is absolutely beautiful and nothing better can ever happen. So if life is this, it's a big question: was it worth it? But if we are just the beginning of the process, then, as you say, why worry about the garage man and the policeman and all those things? Those are phases that are going to go as naturally as the phase of the extinct dinosaur or the extinct little animals in the sea. The concentration is not as great as you can imagine, because you have to think in terms of taking, for instance, if this is an actual town, subdividing very roughly, subdividing in little square and then take one square and putting on top of the other. So it's not that the spaces available are very great. What you're eliminating, what you're miniaturizing is the elimination of the waste space, like the street, the garage, the parking lot, etc., etc., the sewage mains, the telephone poles, all those things are taking space or are taking the feeling of humaneness out of yourself. So it's not that you are so much packing more people in lesser space, you're organizing them in a different way. See, then again, my skeleton has not very much to do with my mind, but my skeleton has to serve my mind in order for the mind to function. And it doesn't matter very much if my mind works as a Marxist or as a capitalist or so. My skeleton is still there doing its job. And it seems to me that that's very much true, is going to be very much true for the city. I really believe that structure has to come before performance. Now, in the case in which I know a little more what might happen, like in Arcosanti, I can see the beginning of a political system or of a social system. That's where for instance, I like to introduce the idea of co-usership, use instead of ownership. I like to introduce the idea of rental instead of ownership and things of this kind. But this somehow, it doesn't influence that much the skeleton. It seems to me that, again, the Marxist city is not very different from the capitalistic city. If you live in a city and you think that the city is where you want to live, is because you are counting on a certain reaching power that will allow you to enjoy the city. Well, enjoy the city means to be able to reach all those institutions, all those people, all those things that you really want to have a reaching distance because you believe that this is a good life. Well, if you define a structure that doesn't do that for you, well, you are failing in producing what you are seeking. I'm just saying that I'd like to produce that kind of structure that allows you to reach those things. It's as simple as that. It's a logistic problem that can be solved only through the reduction of space instead of trying to get into speed, for instance. The idea of speed is an idea completely illusory, because we know that when you have billions of points to be reached by billions of points and interacting with each other, speed is out of the question. So what we can do is to forget about speed and bring in the shrinking of distances. So it seems to me it's so human, the desire of having things reachable by you, biped with two legs, being able to walk and maybe enjoy the walk and reach those things, that I don't see why it should be so political, so social, and so anti-human as you might painting it. You see, the complexity of life is the main element that we have to consider, is the basic, fundamental, main, preponderant element that we have to consider. Or everything else is secondary. We know that life is going to become greater, more lively, with the greatest degree of complexity that is going to be building within itself. All the rest is secondary. This is written everywhere in the process of life. We start from zero, then you get into the first jelly in the seed, and you move into the protozoa, and you keep moving up and up and up and up. Every step is a step from the simpler to the more complex. The next answer is going to be the next complexity, which is the social complexity and the cultural complexity. My point of view is that I want to apply the same behavioral condition that I see proceeding in the long history of life, applied to this new step that moves from the individual to the social and the cultural. It's just that, nothing more than that. The structural necessity, the structural variations, the structural stresses that you are going to encounter are difficulties that you have to solve, because the main proposition is the complexity and the logistics that this complexity demands. For many people, the urban life is not the life they are seeking, so they shouldn't be demanded to live in a city. But if they choose to live in a city, possibly they might choose to live in a city that is going to give them what the city should give them. And the problem now is that our cities are not giving us what we are asking, unless we are privileged people, unless we are parasites, unless we are not part of the bulk of humanity that cannot afford them. And we cannot afford them One reason is that they are so wasteful. The old setup is of such an enormity of wastefulness that we are just have to pay too much. And somehow affluence shows this very well. We say we are affluent, but somehow our affluence goes into steel, into ball bearings, into liquor, into anything but those elements that really make life worth living. And not only this, but if we expanded this condition of affluence to the whole Earth, we would see that we would be dead by now, because the Earth cannot accept that much affluence. It can accept only this little affluence on two continents, the American continent and the European continent. If all of Asia, all of Africa was as affluent as we are, all the Latin America, the poisons in the air would be so thick that we would be gone by now. So we survive just because there are those poor devils that have nothing to look for, in a way, which is a definition of the parasite. So we are fat parasites in a very real sense.
How did Antonio Gaudi influence you?
Well, I don't know how it came about. I never did research on Antonio Gaudi at all. In fact, I got to know him almost accidentally when I was at Taliesin. I like many of his things, but that's about it. And I think I'm getting away from it more and more. In fact, I think I'm completely away from his influence.
Would you say any architect has influenced your work?
Oh yes, but I couldn't pinpoint anything. Maybe Corbu would be the most influential, if I had to pick one. Life works by concentration of things. Prolixity and suburbia works through scatterization of things. So I think the two are antagonistic. You have to choose between suburbia equal death or city equal life.
I'm talking to Paolo Soleri here, and I wanted to ask a few questions to Paolo about where his work at Arcosanti stands now, and what are the projects in the near future that are going to be, that the students will be working on the next few years.
We have to complete a number of buildings, and we have to really do the interiors of all the buildings. So that would be the main activity next year. We will also begin some work on the Terra de Chardin cloister. And we also will be involved in redesigning and development of the main structure in design form.
Redesign in what way?
It has been, up to now, the design has been the original concept, which hasn't been developed in the last 5 years. Now, since we have been involved with the idea of the use of the sun quite a bit, I'm redesigning the structure on the terms of what we have been finding out.
So you're redesigning the whole Arcosanti in terms of solar energy?
Yeah. Well, it was already oriented towards solar energy because of the morphology of the system, or at least some of the systems. Now is even more oriented in that direction.
Are you going to be experimenting with your chimney effect greenhouses on the cloister?
Before the cloister, we are going to do that with the swimming pool, because the swimming pool is going to be cast next year, and hopefully it's going to be completed next year. So that includes a greenhouse, which is going to use the chimney effect to convey the energy into the water.
Well, what sort of events will happen in this new building, the cloisters?
Well, the cloister is basically a meeting place, a small conference center. So it's going to have public spaces and private spaces. And the main public space is going to be like a theater, an amphitheater for about 500 people. And that's going to be an apse, so it is a sun trap. In front of it there's going to be a greenhouse, so that's going to be a greenhouse and the chimney effect combined. Then the structure itself has also two main wings, and those wings have sun collectors for warm air to be blown into the spaces.
Do you see most of the food for the residents of Arcosanti being raised here at the site?
Eventually we would like to have the fresh vegetables definitely grown here. We also might get into proteins and fruits and so on, but that will take time.
What is this Two Sons project that you're now getting involved in?
Well, about 2 years ago I had an idea. I developed a small program around it. Then we got a grant from the Xerox, and then the Bicentennial matched funds with two other institutions. So we have this small grant, and we are developing this idea, and the material is going to be organized for an exhibit at the Xerox in Rochester, and we'll have almost a dozen of concepts presented there, but 6 or 8 will be fairly developed.
Have most of the teams been chosen, or?
Yeah, we have now about 6 people involved, and by the end of December we'll have, or the beginning of January we'll have 20 people or so.
Are most of these university groups, or what sort of groups?
We'll have some architects and some young people. There'll be some of the assistants and some of the participants.
I was just wondering whether Arcosanti would be redesigned in terms of solar energy. Because we were there yesterday, and it was really an unusual situation. But I felt that there wasn't much solar response there to kind of react against
the work done outdoor is under solar energy conditions. It's the apps again, this foundry, for instance.
How about the living units?
Living units, no, well, they are what they are. The idea was that if you go below grade, you get a good insulation, and you can get away with the immediate surrounding, which is going to be suburban. And but it wasn't specifically developed in terms of what we are developing now. And Arcosanti is not an arcology anyhow; it's a suburban development.
That's true.
Which has few more things than just living and sleeping, but it's not a city condition. It's not an urban condition.
In the near future, when more residents start moving into Arcosanti,